The open source initiative has rigged their own election for their own board of directors in what appears to be a very bizarre effort to keep out open source and free software advocates. I'm going to repeat that again because it's just too asinine. The open source initiative, they have literally tampered with ballots of their members in what appears to be an effort to keep out people who are the most prominent open source and free software advocates available. It's insane. They even require, this is a requirement, quote, using proprietary software is a non-negotiable requirement for board participation in the open source initiative. Okay, here's the thing. I don't fault an organization for needing to use some proprietary software. No big deal. But to make it a requirement is insane. And then to be an organization all about promoting openness and to rig your own elections and ignore the votes of your members is about the least open thing I can think of. I'm going to walk you through this now because it's wild. So back in February, a gentleman by the name of Bradley Kuhn, who many of you will know, he used to be on the board of the Free Software Foundation. He works at the Software Freedom Conservancy and has since the early 1600s. I mean, when it comes to software licensing and source code licensing, he's kind of a legend. This is what he does. I struggle to think of many people on planet Earth that would be more of an expert when it comes to open source free software and the licensing therein than Bradley Kuhn. But back in February, Bradley Kuhn posted that he was going to be running for a seat on the board of the Open Source Initiative. Quote, I accepted the nomination as candidate for an affiliate seat in the Open Source Initiative Board of Directors elections. I was nominated by the following 4 Open Source Initiative affiliates: the Matrix Foundation, the Perl Foundation, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and Snowdrift. To my knowledge, I'm the only affiliate candidate in the history of these Open Source Initiative Board of Directors elections to be nominated by 4 affiliates, and I am also endorsed by the Debian Project. So, I mean, basically, he was a shoo-in, right? There's almost, if you're going to have an organization that talks about source code licensing and Bradley Kuhn shows up and says, I'd like to be involved, he's probably going to be involved. People are going to vote for him in, right? He's a big dog in that race. Now things started to get weird after that, though. He was sent right after the voting for this position had closed, right? Everyone had submitted their ballots. The voting was closed. And after the vote was closed, the current open source initiative leadership sent him a document that they said he had to sign before they released the results. I'm going to read from his blog post here. Voting closed on Monday, March 17th. 1 hour later, candidates were surprised to receive an email from the Open Source Initiative demanding that all candidates sign a board agreement before the results were posted. None of the candidates were informed that they won or not at this point. This was surprising because during mandatory orientation for this election, candidates were told the opposite, that a board agreement need not be signed until the board formally appointed you as a director, as the elections are only advisory. OSI's board need not follow election results in any event. It was also surprising because the deadline was a mere 47 hours later. Okay, I'm going to point out a couple of things here because this is really important. The Open Source Initiative Board of Directors are not actually elected positions, right? So the elections, when people who are members of the OSI vote, they're voting to suggest who they would like to be on the board of directors. The Open Source Initiative itself does not have to follow that suggestion, right? It is not democratic in any way. There is no representation of the membership of the Open Source Initiative at all, not even a skosh. It is not at all democratic. So the open source initiative could say, oh, everyone and their dog voted for this person. Whatever. I can ignore them and appoint someone who wasn't even running, right? That is absolutely allowed at the open source initiative, because this organization is about as far from open as you can get. Bradley continues, many of us candidates attempted to get clarification over the last 46 hours, but the open source initiative has not communicated clear answers in response to those requests. Based on these unclear responses, the best we can surmise is that the open source initiative intends to modify the ballots cast by affiliates and members to remove any candidate who misses this new deadline. We are loath to assume the worst, but there's little choice given the confusing responses and surprising change in requirements and deadlines. Okay, now I want to point something out here, because this is bonkers. This is not the first time in this election that the open source initiative has changed the rules after the fact to tell people that they've missed deadlines and therefore cannot run. Back on February 25th, the open source initiative announced, quote, the deadline for applications to run for the board was February 17th. Everyone qualified to run for elections received an email notification with the time zone. We've updated the public-facing web pages so this issue won't reappear. So what happened here? Quote, we've been asked about the possibility of extending the deadline for the one person who expressed an interest in running but misunderstood the deadline. This would be unfair to the other candidates who submitted their applications on time. So at this point, the open source initiative, before the elections had even occurred, an individual submitted their application to be running for a seat on the board. They did so on time in their time zone. However, after the fact, after this deadline had come and passed, the open source initiative modified their rules to make it so that the time zone that the deadline occurred in made it, the new time zone made it so that that one person would not be allowed, would have missed it, would have missed the deadline, right? They moved the goalpost so that that person missed and would not allow that person in. Now, that particular individual had been critical of some of the goings-ons with the open source initiative, and they did not want him involved. It was absolutely asinine. Now, here we have another situation where after the votes closed, the open source initiative came up with a brand new set of rules that they sent out with a hard deadline, a set of rules that they knew a couple of the specific candidates would have a hard time with because of the very nature of what they were asking of people. So I'm going to show you this right now. Quote, this is again from Bradley Kuhn. Quote, so I decided to sign a board agreement with the open source initiative. Here is the PDF that I just submitted to the open source initiative, emailed to the open source initiative instead. The OSI, the open source initiative, recommended DocuSign, that he used DocuSign to submit this PDF file. But, quote, I refuse to use proprietary software for my free and open source software volunteer work on moral and ethical grounds. End quote. Okay. All right. So here comes the other thing. The open source initiative is asking people to use proprietary software and services to be part of the open source initiative. That's funny. That's funny. That's like saying, you know what? If you want to be on the Coca-Cola board of directors, first you have to inject into your arteries Pepsi. Like, wait, what? Why would I have to do that? That's bizarre. Was it a necessity? Is using the DocuSign service a necessity? No. Are these crazy hardcore legal documents that where there's like loans and like big things? No. This is for a little open source organization here. Now here's what's interesting. Bradley Kuhn, because Bradley Kuhn is all about openness and transparency, he posted the entire PDF file that they asked that he sign. God bless you, Bradley. And what Bradley did is he went ahead and modified it. I love it. I love the cojones in this guy. All right. So that particular document, you'll notice I've got part of it on the screen right now. For those of you watching the video version, has a bunch of capital X's struck through one particular bullet point sentence, right? What board members can expect from each other. And one of them is that they foster collaborative discussions. Another is that they participate in board discussions by exploring issues and context and blah, blah, blah. Very boring. But there's one bullet point in there that's struck out. And then he adds the little note, this clause struck and replaced on page 3. Okay, well, now what clause was struck out? What clause in this document did Bradley Kuhn object to strongly? I'm going to read it to you now. Disagree during board deliberations, but support publicly all board decisions, especially those that do not have unanimous consent. End quote. All right, so pretty straightforward, right? What the open source initiative is saying is that if you disagree with what the open source initiative is doing, if you disagree with what the board decides to do and you're a dissenting voice, you cannot speak about it. Right? That's what the OSI is saying, is you cannot tell people that you disagree. If the OSI votes to murder all puppies and you were the one dissenting voice and you came out and said, hey guys, I voted against the whole murder puppies thing. Well, you would be kicked off the open source initiative board of directors because you spoke out about how you disagreed, right? This is crazy. I mean, even like the Supreme Court of the United States, they publish dissenting opinions. You're allowed to dissent, especially in an open organization. And clearly that's what Bradley Kuhn thinks. He proposed replacing it with this struck clause. Quote, signing potential director agrees to negotiate in good faith after appointment to reach consensus with all directors on a universally agreed replacement for the struck clause. In meantime, upon appointment, director agrees to the following. Board members are discouraged from making public statements that don't align with a prior OSI decision. Board members shall A, communicate with reasonable advance notice to the board of their plan to voice public disagreement, and B, make best efforts to respectfully communicate the majority's decision, and C, to include, if in written form, a link to any relevant official OSI statements. That was Bradley Kuhn's suggested proposal of how he would modify that statement, and he signed it and initialed that statement. He then provided that to the open source initiative, and it sounds like they went dark on it. They then announced the winners of the Open Source Initiative Board of Directors shortly thereafter. The Open Source Initiative Board of Directors met to validate the results of the polls, confirmed Carlo Piana as director, and welcomed Ruth Sully, recommended by the affiliates, and McCoy Smith, recommended by individual supporters as new directors. Now, note some of the wording here. Validate the results. I think what they really mean there is change the results. And also the wording of recommended by affiliates, recommended by individual supporters. You'll note that they're very careful to not say that this is who people voted for, because again, the votes for the open source initiative are 100% irrelevant. They listen to the recommendations of people and they can disregard them whenever they want. The open source initiative has no obligation to run in a democratic way or in an open or in a transparent way. In fact, they ignore votes and only use proprietary software. It's crazy. The Open Source Initiative thanks all of those who participated in the 2025 board polls by asking questions to the candidates, engaging in discussions, and casting a ballot. 3 candidates have been excluded from the final tally. 2 were ineligible as they did not sign the current board agreement. 1 returned the side agreement after the deadline passed. End quote. As kind of expected, as predicted by Bradley Kuhn before it even happened, and as is the common practice of the open source initiative. Move the goalposts after the fact in order to keep out people that you don't want in. And here's the votes This is for the affiliate positions for the board of directors. And they show 4 candidates, and they show, what percentage each of those candidates got or whatnot. And you'll notice that that there's candidates missing. There's certainly no Bradley Kuhn there. And Bradley Kuhn is, again, an absolute giant in this particular world. I mean, there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So the odds of him getting less than anyone here are incredibly slim. I'm sure Bradley would be more modest about it, but this is like if Richard Stallman is running for the Free Software Foundation, right? To be on a seat on the board against some dude named Phil that no one had ever heard of before. Well, okay, the odds are Richard Stallman's probably going to beat Phil. Now, some of these names have some, awareness. They're not unknown people entirely, but when it comes to Bradley Kuhn, the comparison is pretty extreme. And then they hopped over on Mastodon, and there's been lots of back and forth with the executive director of the open source initiative, a guy named Stefano Mafuli, and Bradley Kuhn, and as well as others, leading to Bradley Kuhn eventually saying this quote. This is directed to Stefano, the executive director of the OSI. Your argument supports open source initiative position on why they were not appointed, but it does not explain why you tampered with the ballots to remove their names and remove our names and refuse to support what the electorate recommended. The open source initiative was always free to ignore the electorate. We all know open source initiatives elections are advisory and not binding. Your refusal to engage in public dialogue with your electorate also indicates the open source initiative's abilities in consensus building may be lacking. And then one of the other board member candidates who was also kicked out for the same reason. You notice this guy named is Fontana. He wasn't on that bar graph. He wasn't anywhere listed on the vote tallies. He was on the ballots, but he didn't do things correctly. But he asked, why was the urgent request made only after voting closed? Why was a brand new deadline imposed? It seemed ridiculous. And he says, quote, when I was an open source initiative board director in the past, there was no pre-signing requirement. End quote. Note a few things there. One, this is a brand new requirement that they just pulled out of thin air, right? Only when it seemed like some new people were going to be taken over. And of the people that were poised to take over, that were all set to win these elections, one of them had been on the open source initiative board in the past and was likely to gather a huge number of votes. And one of them was previous on the Free Software Foundation, Software Freedom Conservancy, and on and on and on, and was likely to get a large number of votes. It's crazy. Now, one of the people from the open source initiative that's a bit of an apologist there made a simple declaration. And it took great offense to the idea that anyone would want to use open source software to be part of the open source initiative, saying, quote, open source initiative clearly communicated on the prep call that using proprietary software is a non-negotiable requirement for board participation. End quote. Again, that's insane. That's insane. Holy heavens. So 3 people were kicked out after the ballots were cast, after the votes were cast, and the open source initiative will not tell people how many votes those people got, because I'm thinking at least 2 of them probably won. I'm just saying, in the absence of all other facts, it would suggest to me likely, if I had to bet, 2 of those people won and 3 of them were kicked out. And then a 4th person was kicked out before the voting even started because they changed the rules on him at the last possible second, like after the deadline has passed. It's crazy. It's crazy. Now, this is not an unusual thing in the open source world, though. If you think open source software, you might think to yourself, oh, open, transparent, democratic. Oh, the people have a voice. But that is absolutely almost never the case. It is profoundly untrue. Open source organizations have a long, crazy track record of being the most undemocratic organizations you can possibly imagine. A case in point, let's look at the Linux Foundation. Just a quick overview of this one. Back in 2016, I'm reading from an article entitled, "Why Did the Linux Foundation Cut Independent Board Seats?" This is from Network World, which I actually wrote for this magazine back then, from one writer named John Gold, excellent tech reporter from back in the day. Quote, "As of January 15th, 2016, the Linux Foundation bylaws were changed to remove a provision that allowed for the election of 2 board members by the group's individual affiliates. The entirety of the board's membership is now selected by the Linux Foundation corporate members." Yeah. So many of you don't realize this, but there was a time when the Linux Foundation had 2 seats that just your average run-of-the-mill members of the Linux Foundation, which you and I can become for a very modest fee, can elect our own, to have our own representative to sit alongside companies like Microsoft and VMware and Red Hat and the like, right? We had that opportunity. Well, in 2016, the Linux Foundation was like, yeah, not anymore, suckers, yoink. Continuing in the article, quote, "One of those corporate members is VMware, which is currently facing a licensing lawsuit in Germany backed by the Software Freedom Conservancy, a nonprofit organization that provides legal services to free software and open source projects. The Software Freedom Conservancy's executive director is Karen Sandler, who announced publicly in September that she planned to run for one of the individual board member positions," end quote. So, to be clear here, there's a pattern. The Linux Foundation had board member seats that people could run for. Someone from the Software Freedom Conservancy, someone critical of people who violate GPL licensing and the like, said, "I'm going to run." The Linux Foundation, who gets all their money, their $250 million from those sorts of companies like VMware, said, "Never mind, we don't have those seats anymore. Democracy gone." Flash forward to today, the Open Source Initiative, another member of the Software Freedom Conservancy, another free software purist kind of person, says, "I'm going to run for this position." Ran for that position. I'm going to guess probably won. Probably, I don't know. And the Open Source Initiative changed the rules after the fact repeatedly in order to make sure that he's not on the board. Over and over again, this sorts of thing seems to be happening. People really don't want people from Software Freedom Conservancy on their boards. Let's talk about the Gnome Foundation. The Gnome Foundation, just this last spring-ish, they had their elections, right? People voted for who was on their board of directors. The board of directors did not like one of the people that was on the board. So they, in secret, without telling anyone, kicked that person out. A voted for person, a person that the members wanted to be in place. They voted for him to be in place. They kicked him out and demanded that he stay silent about it. They didn't tell a soul outside of the board of directors for 2 months that they had just invalidated the votes of everybody in the Gnome Foundation. They held secret meetings. They did not document any of it. There was zero transparency, absolutely no accountability. And the only reason we found out about this is the Gnome Foundation eventually had to make an appearance at a Gnome event, a Gnome annual event, and that particular board of directors representative, he wouldn't be there because they kicked him out several months earlier. So they eventually had to fess up that they'd done this. And they just hate democracy. The Gnome Foundation hates democracy. And this isn't like the first or the last time. They recently just started appointing several people to the Gnome Foundation board of directors. There was no votes. No one cast any votes. Most of the people that end up in the board of directors from the Gnome Foundation, I don't even know if half of them got voted in there. And some of them that get voted in get kicked out by the Gnome Foundation if they speak the wrong words or speak out of turn. It's just a regular ongoing thing. And back to the whole open source initiative using closed source. this is a running issue. So the Open Source Initiative released what they called the Open Source Artificial Intelligence definition this some months back. And a key part of something being labeled as open source artificial intelligence, according to the Open Source Initiative, is that it doesn't have to be open source. It just has to have some open source parts. Like all the training data and all that can be closed, proprietary, and unavailable. You just have to say that it exists, and therefore it's open source. And the Open Source Initiative partnered with the United Nations. We just talked about this, 2 days ago. The Open Source Initiative partnered with the United Nations to sign and support this big United Nations open source principles movement. And it was kind of dumb. No one really cared. It wasn't all that interesting. But one of the things I found truly fascinating about it was the only way you can support this open source principles movement from the United Nations, what the Open Source Initiative did, is by using Microsoft Office 365. Now, again, I'm not dogging on Microsoft Office. 25 years ago, I used to help build Microsoft Office. I'm not dogging on it, but it's not exactly open source. And if you're the Open Source Initiative and the United Nations open source principles, you'd think you'd use open source. But the very first thing that the United Nations open source principles community, whatever, put out was a Microsoft Office 365 thing that you can sign using proprietary software. There's no open source involved. So here we are at this point, where we have numerous open source organizations that are extraordinarily non-democratic, very closed down, very non-transparent, the opposite of open in every conceivable way. Like, there's no definition of open that the Open Source Initiative currently is in line with. They use closed source software. They demand that their board members use closed source software. They demand it. They don't tell people what they're doing. They don't tell people what votes were cast during elections, and they don't even agree with the elections, and they don't have to abide by elections whatsoever. There's nothing open left about the Open Source Initiative. It's absolutely fascinating, and I would take this opportunity to make this a reminder. The Open Source Initiative has absolutely no control of open source or the term open source. They've threatened people with legal action around this. They've tried really hard. They've tried to trademark it. There's been trademark disputes and threats and all sorts of stuff to try and get control of the phrase open source. And they have been denied at every step of the every turn. But they want it. And they're currently cheating, lying, and tampering with people's ballots in order to maintain some semblance of pretending to have that control. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I've reached out to a number of parties here. I've reached out to the Open Source Initiative. I've reached out to Bradley Kuhn. I've reached out to a bunch of people. I'm going to try and get as many of people's viewpoints on this as possible, because there's stuff we don't know, right? What were the votes that were cast, right? Like, what are the actual numbers? Can we verify that? I would like that information. I would like the viewpoints of the Open Source Initiative, of the executive director of the OSI. I would like the viewpoints of Bradley Kuhn. And I'm hoping that we can get some of these people to at least provide statements or whatnot over the coming days, because this is ridiculous. It's utterly preposterous. But we'll keep following it. Thank you to all the Lunduke Journal subscribers. You make this possible. Once again, go to lunduke.com, where there's so many different ways to listen and watch the Lunduke Journal shows, to read what the Lunduke Journal puts out, to interact with the Lunduke Journal, and most importantly, to support the Lunduke Journal. Because if you haven't noticed, this show started off without saying things like, "This brought to you by Square Brownie Space Planet Visa." Like, there was none of that, right? We don't take any money from any corporation. We don't take any, even a penny from big tech. And because of that, the Lunduke Journal can actually tell you the truth. I can speak my mind and do actual investigative reporting on this stuff, which, well, no other tech news outlet can do. So thank you for allowing that to happen. Again, lunduke.com. It's a great website. You love it very much. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare end broadcast.